The cerebral hemispheres exhibit what's called lateralization. Lateralization is the specialization of the different sides or the different cerebral hemispheres. So lateralization is the specialization of the different sides of the brain or the different cerebral hemispheres. So the left side of the brain or the left cerebral hemisphere tends to dominate in language abilities, math, and logic. So the left side of the brain or the left cerebral hemisphere is going to have greater control over language abilities, math, and logic. The right cerebral hemisphere is going to have greater control over visual spatial skills, intuition, emotion, and artistic skills. So the right cerebral hemisphere is going to have greater control over visual spatial skills, intuition, emotion, and artistic skills. So although the cerebral hemispheres exhibit lateralization or specialization, it's important to realize that both cerebral hemispheres still are functioning for almost every single activity. So you still need both the left and the right cerebral hemispheres in order to carry out almost any activity throughout the day. So the cerebral hemispheres might dominate in one task versus the other. However, they're both still functioning in order to control every single activity. Because both cerebral hemispheres are necessary for all activities, these two hemispheres need to be able to communicate with one another. The two cerebral hemispheres are going to communicate with one another because of these groups of neurons that are going to extend from the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere. These neurons are organized into a structure called the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum is known as a major commissure. A major commissure is just a group of neuron axons or a tract of neuron axons that extends from one hemisphere to the next. So this allows for the hemispheres to communicate with one another. So we can see that corpus callosum here. So we've got our corpus callosum in this diagram shown right here. We've also got it shown in this diagram here. Again, the corpus callosum is known as a major commissure. It's a group of neuron axons that are extending from one hemisphere to the next. This allows for the two hemispheres to communicate with one another. The cerebral hemispheres are composed of an outer cortex of gray matter, known as the cerebral cortex, internal white matter, and then these islands of gray matter dispersed throughout the white matter, known as basal nuclei. So you've got a cerebral cortex composed of gray matter, you've got internal white matter, and then you've got subcortical gray matter, known as basal nuclei. White matter is going to be neuron axons that are myelinated. So white matter refers to neuron axons that are myelinated. Gray matter corresponds to neuron cell bodies. So the white matter in our cerebral hemispheres can be divided into association fibers, projection fibers, or commissures. So association fibers, projection fibers, and commissures are just going to be these groups of neuron axons or these collections of neuron tracts. So we're going to have association fibers, which are going to be groups of neurons or neuron tracts that extend from one lobe to the next. So we've got association fibers that are connecting different parts of the same hemisphere. So they're essentially running from one lobe to the next, ensuring that the different lobes of the cerebral hemisphere can communicate with one another. So association fibers are neurons that are running from lobe to lobe within one hemisphere. So we can see those here in pink. So association fibers are going to be neuron tracts that allow the lobes within a hemisphere to communicate with one another. We then have projection fibers. Projection fibers are going to be groups of neuron axons that are ascending and descending to and from upper and lower central nervous system structures. In other words, these projection fibers are groups of neurons that are allowing for the cerebral cortex to communicate with lower central nervous system structures, such as the spinal cord. So projection fibers are going to ascend and descend from the cerebral cortex to lower central nervous system structures, such as the spinal cord. And then a commissure is just going to be a group of neurons that are going from one hemisphere to the next. So these are fibers that are allowing for the two hemispheres, so the right and the left hemispheres, to communicate with one another. So the cerebral cortex has cerebral hemispheres, have a cerebral cortex, internal white matter, and subcortical gray matter. The subcortical gray matter is known as basal nuclei. So basal nuclei are just these islands of gray matter. Each hemisphere is going to have 3 islands of gray matter: the caudate, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. So these are the 3 islands of gray matter, or the 3 basal nuclei that exist within each hemisphere. These islands of gray matter are neuron cell bodies. These neuron cell bodies function to control movement by relaying information to the motor areas. So they're relaying information to and from the motor areas of our frontal lobe, and they're helping to filter out any unnecessary or inappropriate movements. So our basal nuclei help to control movement. So they're assisting in the planning of our movements by helping to filter out any unnecessary movements or inappropriate movements to carry out some task. Basal nuclei are never directly communicating with any of our motor pathways or our motor neurons. Instead, they might receive that motor plan from the premotor area, and then the basal nuclei might send kind of their edited version of that plan to the primary motor complex. So they're essentially receiving the plan for what movements are going to be carried out. They're filtering out any unnecessary movements or inappropriate movements, so they're editing that plan, and then relaying that information back to the primary motor complex so that that area can then communicate directly with those large pyramidal motor neurons. So the subcortical gray matter or the basal nuclei function to control movements or assist in controlling movements by relaying information to and from the motor areas, helping to filter out any unnecessary movements. We have a couple of disorders that are associated with degeneration to the basal nuclei. So in both Parkinson's disease as well as Huntington's disease, we actually have degeneration of the basal nuclei or damage to the basal nuclei. This results in patients who have really rapid and jerky movements. So you notice that patients with Parkinson's and Huntington's disease are going to have these rapid and jerky movements because if the basal nuclei are degraded or degenerated, you're not going to be able to filter out any of those unnecessary or inappropriate movements. So ultimately, it's going to then affect the overall control of our voluntary movements of skeletal muscle.